Hello, welcome to the GW Books Club, where me and my friend Stu are reading through the very first novels published by Games Workshop between 1989 and 1991. This month, we have read Inquisitor by Ian Watson, the first fiction novel set in the 40k universe. Now, before we get into our discussion, I will provide an overview of the story, but I do just want to warn people that there are some mature themes and difficult topics in this book, and we will be exploring them in our discussion. On the industrialized jungle world of Stalinvast, a Genestealer cult uprising is brutally put down by an Inquisitor, Hark Obispal, and his army of Imperial troops. Watching from the shadows is a second Inquisitor, along with his retinue, who was secretly dispatched to the planet to ensure that things went smoothly. Jack Draco is an expert in his craft, a secret policeman acting on behalf of the Ordo Malleus to protect the Imperium and its emperor, the Callidus Assassin Melindy, capable of morphing her body into the shape of a Genestealer hybrid. Grim the Squat, a young but gifted engineer with a crush on that unattainable assassin, and the navigator Google, an acerbic poet, make up Jack's team. In the aftermath of the uprising, Jack is taunted by an unusual figure, Zephyro Carnelian, the Harlequin Man, who has psychically hacked into the Inquisitor's divination tool, the Emperor's Tarot. Following the trail of this Harlequin Man, Jack and his team discover an unfathomably vast, self-replicating entity lying beneath the hive cities of Stalinvast, a so-called Hydra, composed in part of the stuff of chaos, the immaterium of the warp. From here, Jack's destiny is forever changed as he chases his elusive tormentor Carnelian across the galaxy to a secret meeting of a hidden inquisitorial cabal, taking place on a space hulk. From there, they go to a Slaneshi pleasure world deep in the Eye of Terror, and even to the Imperial Palace on Holy Terror, where an audience with the Emperor may give truth to the lie of conspiracy that threatens all human life in the 41st millennium. Stu, good to be chatting again and getting into the latest GW Books Club. We're talking about Inquisitor by Ian Watson this time. Let's start with just a sort of a quick overview, I guess, of your general impression of the sort of story. Did you enjoy the story overall?
Yeah, I think so. Overall, there was a lot of really good bits, especially some descriptive bits around the Warhammer 40k universe, which feels very grimdark and Warhammer 40k, which is really nice and refreshing to see from something so early in the world of Warhammer books. Some nice. I love the bits towards the end on Terra, and some just really good scenes that sort of set the universe up and the galaxy, I suppose, up very nicely. I probably enjoyed that side of it more than other parts of the story. I didn't fall in love with any of the characters that much, less than I expected to. Sure. Melindy's probably my favorite character in the book. The others I just didn't fully get. I'm not sure if I even liked one of them. Maybe we're not supposed to like them. I think that's part, but I think some of the interplay between the characters was maybe a little clumsy at times. And then yeah, there are some other elements which we're going to probably discuss in and out throughout the discussion today, that I feel at times were stressed too much, that maybe took away from the rest of the story. And I also felt that while there was a huge amount, I found like there was a huge amount in this story, an awful lot going on at different stages, but it also felt quite slow and ponderous at times as well. And there were passages of descriptive nature, or often thoughts and remembrances that seemed to go on for a long time. So it felt like it was quite slow, but when you look back in retrospect, a lot has still happened in a relatively short book. Because, there's not any longer than any of the other novels in this series. So it's probably quite a lot of thoughts. So what about you? What are your overarching thoughts?
It's fascinating to hear you there, sort of sharing that view, because I think for the most part, I had a very similar sort of perspective on it. So I enjoyed this book overall. I thought it paints an incredible picture of the 40k universe. So the way in which the Imperium works, the way in which Inquisitors work, the sort of the feeling of these worlds and the depth to them. A lot of the descriptive stuff was really interesting. There's loads of cool ideas. There's moments in here and sort of action scenes or particular sort of story choices that are really cool that I really like. Ideas like the Emperor's Tarot and sort of how that's explored, or bits of technology and things like that that add so much to, you know, the rogue trader version of the 40k universe that was around at the time as it's sort of slowly morphing into the second edition. So it paints a great picture, and it's a 40k universe I really like. I think it's great from that perspective. But I share your view around the characters, for instance. I don't think I really liked any of them, actually. Even Melindy, the assassin, who probably is the most interesting, she was more interesting to me in the short story that she's in, The Alien Beast Within, that was in the Deathwing collection, also written by Watson. She had sort of a more interesting character there. Some of that carries through and we get some interesting stuff from her, but I didn't like her necessarily as a character. I didn't really like any of the others. I thought Grim, for instance, the Squat, was a more interesting side character in his short story in Warped Stars in the Deathwing collection as well. He seemed a bit more, I don't know, on the ball and kind of engaged, whereas here he's kind of comic relief and he's got an odd relationship with Melindy, which I'm sure we'll get into. So there's sort of things that didn't excite me and didn't work for me sort of in the characters. And then as a story, as a sort of plot, it's quite unusual, I guess I would say. And again, not to be too hard on the sort of comparison to those shorts, because they're, you know, it's a short story, it's very different what you're writing there. But the short stories had a very clear narrative. They had a start and an end, and they had arcs within them for the sort of main characters. There were interesting ideas around what it's like for a psyker to emerge in the 41st millennium, what it's like for a Callidus assassin to go undercover in a Genestealer cult. So they were like missions and stories that made a lot of sense and played really well. There's a lot of ambiguity to the plot of this book, where things are happening, but they don't necessarily make sense, and there's a lot of stuff that's not revealed. And part of that might be because this is the first part of a trilogy. Part of it feels like it's almost like a tone poem where we're just going to float around in the 41st millennium for a bit and see what happens in a way. Not necessarily a bad thing, but an unusual experience, I'd say.
I think so. I think the story, that the proper story that comes towards the sort of second half of the book is actually quite a solid idea. And I know you haven't read the Horus Heresy series, but Cabal and Hydra, these are things that, you know, that come up in the future. And if you look at the history of the Alpha Legion, and there's a sort of a third group of people during the Horus Heresy that maybe have their own ideas, and a lot of the Alpha Legion stuff is, are they traitors, or are they actually working for the Emperor, or maybe they're under a third control? There was talk about Eldar again in this book, wasn't there, about it, and the links with the Cabal. Well, this kind of all comes back in the Heresy, talk of Old Ones and things as well. So it's quite interesting how some of these ideas resurface later on in later writing, which is really good. But at this time, you know, whether they were the same ideas, I imagine not. So it's just modern writers, I imagine, picking up on cool little nuggets and turning it into a way of adding greater depth to a later story. So maybe I responded to those because of read all 54 books of the Horus Heresy series and all of these things. Maybe that's what it is. Going back to what you said about the characters, I can't help but wonder whether they weren't given time to grow and be the characters that we saw in those earlier stories. And you were talking about Melindy, and I wonder whether she's, in her short story, a lot of it was through her own thoughts and her frustrations, her fear, her career, her change. And this was through the eyes of the males. She's very, very rarely portrayed through her own thoughts.
Sure.
And, you know, she was kind of objectified by all three of them, really. They all clearly fancied her. And so much of the writing was geared around the way she looked and the power that she had over them because of that.
Hmm.
And then, of course, an awful lot of it was to do through Jack's mind anyway. So he was the main narrator. Huge swathes of the book are him remembering, and you're getting his backstory. And they're quite interesting in themselves. They might have made better short stories, so they often maybe slow the pacing down. These long sections of him remembering black ships and things. So it's good. It's potentially good, but I did think it messed the pacing up. But anyway, back to the Melindy's character. I just feel like she wasn't given enough time to be herself and speak for herself in the story. And then even more so, the even more bit characters of Grimm and Google, I don't think we're supposed to like. But
Sure.
the relationship between Google and Grimm, I don't know, it just seems a little bit
Well, it seems like it's
childish and
supposed to
lazy
be,
at times, isn't it?
yeah, it's supposed to be the sort of buddy cop
but
kind of thing where they bicker, but they love each other, really, I guess, is the sort of thing. But you raise a really interesting point, actually, in that in one of the devices that the book employs that I really like is that it starts with almost this statement of intent from Inquisitor Jack Draco saying, this is like a true story, but it's my story, so I'm going to tell you what happened. And actually, I guess on the one hand, that introduces some really cool ideas because that makes the entire thing has an unreliable narrator because it's just one person's perspective on literally everything that occurs. And what occurs is a conspiracy, the likes of which no one has ever seen before, that could topple the universe and positions Jack Draco at the heart of saving that universe. So it's kind of self-serving in a way for him to tell this story in this way. But then you're getting his perspective on, so when you mention that all three of the male main characters or sort of sent the team with the Inquisitor, including Jack Draco himself, all clearly are attracted to Melindy. There's a lot of dwelling on her physicality and how attractive she is. But this is all from Jack Draco's perspective. So maybe Grimm and Google didn't actually care about her at all, but because Jack is so obsessed with her, he thinks everybody else does because he's sort of, he's defensive about it. He's obsessed with her himself, so everybody must be obsessed with her. So there's maybe a way to explain some of that, because if you take it on face value, it's a bit disappointing to have just how many times do we need to hear how attractive this female character is? Do we need to hear again that every male character really likes her? It's both boring and cliched and it's unnecessary. But if it's all from Jack Draco's sort of somewhat perverted and somewhat sexually obsessed mind, because there's a lot of stuff about his repression of sexuality and all that sort of stuff that I'm sure we'll explore. So you could argue, you could defend it in that way, I guess.
You could. And that could be it. I get the impression that the person who's obsessed with the character Melindy is the author, and that's why we see her portrayed that way. Because it's almost like the music goes slow every time that she's kind of described, isn't it? It's a little bit. It's a little bit. I mean, it's made light of it, and it's a shame, I think, because I think it does lessen her a little bit compared to the character. She's clearly still formidable at doing her role and her job. And she, again, they wouldn't get through without her. She's pivotal in a lot of really important moments. But yeah, I think she's, apart from, I suppose, later in the story, when her and Jack have their moment, post the first meeting with the cabal, her intelligence comes to the fore then, because her conversation with him enables him to settle some things in his mind and make a decision. So again, I think she was good then. I think that was a good scene, and a good example of actually when you have two characters genuinely talking to each other, and there's there's real meaning to that conversation rather than just through the eyes of Jack more. And that bit was very good. So it shows that the story was able to do that at points. Yeah. But maybe that was the only point where things were so much from her perspective. There were elements, I'm sure. And I'm probably misremembering it now because I've got that idea in my mind. But
no, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, and I think you're right that scene was well done and it plays a role in the story. I don't have any problem with everything building up to the two of them sleeping together, and then that actually helps Jack, clear his mind, and it does speak to, it's sort of been talked about that there's a kind of almost a Catholicism is being explored through the novel in the way in which the religion of the imperium is explored, and the fact that it's a suppression of those sexual urges and what's really inside oneself, and you have to subsume your own self into this order of whether that's the Inquisitors, whether that's the Assassins. You basically can't be yourself and have your own desires because you have to put the Empire and the Emperor first. So all of that sort of stuff is explored, and the sort of guilt and the shame, because Jack talks about how he's only sort of known the touch of a woman once, and then he's sort of not allowed himself that for 20 or 30 years until this point with Melindy. That does work. It's maybe undermined a little bit, though, by that earlier stuff where
the long lead up to it.
Yeah, exactly. If this had just happened and sort of more organically occurred in the story, then that probably would work better than every character sort of oogling her and ogling her and sort of being obsessed with her in so many
100%. In fact, if it was just the two-way attraction, that would have worked as well. In fact, that's just normal. That's just human interaction. I mean, I don't know if the Inquisition have any rules on workplace relationships in their handbook, whether he's broken any, whether that's misconduct and he's going to get a final written warning or something.
Yeah, I mean, the Administratum Human Resourcium is probably sending out some notes on this one. But yeah, it definitely that aspect of it works really well. But the other dynamics around the other characters, Grim is very sort of a sort of puppy dog kind of love. He's always chasing after Melindy. It's quite odd, really, because I mean, the opening of the novel starts with a very cool conceit, which is that there's an Inquisitor leading the defense of a world against a Genestealer cult uprising. And whilst that is happening, this second Inquisitor and his retinue are there to basically keep tabs on it and do some sort of secret mission. And then that is when Melindy, because she can turn into a Genestealer hybrid, goes down to get involved and to sort of try and help out the first Inquisitor. And Grim just decides, I'll go too. And he kind of follows her. And I think he does do something later on that sort of helps, but it's a bit odd because he even crashes his trike at one point, trying to keep up with her. It's just it's the comedy element.
She has to rescue him in Stealer form, and he didn't know that she could turn into a Stealer.
Right.
So what should have been it almost adds a bit of comedy to a scene that probably shouldn't have comedy in it. Yeah. And I wonder if it would have been better if you keep the comedy between Grim and Gugal, but don't have them. Part of the underlying thing with that bickering between them is clearly because they both are attracted to Melindy. You remove that part and you keep the love part just between the two main characters, we'll call them. Yeah. And you make them the comic relief, and remove Grim from scenes like that, because I don't think it was needed. Yeah. And I think it actually solves a lot of the problems. I agree with it.
Yeah. And they actually already have built in, because it's explored elsewhere in quite a fun way, a sort of pre-existing reason to be bickering. And that is because Google, the navigator, believes in the sort of spiritual sanctity of machines and the Adeptus Mechanicus style of praying to the engines of the ship to hope that they work, whilst Grim is an engineer. So he's actually fixing the machines, and he's kind of, the religion is ridiculous. It's not, it's kind of heretical stuff, which I'm sure he wouldn't get away with. But it's this really interesting idea, and you could have had just that be the back and forth of religion versus science throughout. Yeah, and that could have paid off in a really fun way.
It was the Omnicide, it was WD-40. Right?
Exactly. Exactly that. That's great. Yeah. You're
right though. That's all that needed, and that was funny. And I suppose towards the end of the book, when it's almost that bickering has toned down a little bit, it's a little bit more lighthearted because the love was showing a little bit more. I think it worked more then. But at the beginning, I just thought, what's going on?
Yeah, because they're not.
They don't seem to. None of them likes each other. Google was very unlikable at the beginning.
Agreed. Yeah,
he was pithy and sarcastic and overly dry. Right, and I thought, well, I'm probably not supposed to like him, but still. Yeah. Again, because of the way that they were not just attracted to attractive Melindy, but it was almost over the top, almost uncomfortably long descriptions of how attractive they are, especially Google almost felt a little bit creepy. That the first thing, and again, I think that colored my opinion of those characters right really early on. It made me struggle to really care much about them throughout the story.
But then it
Whereas
does
Jack
overcome.
and Melindy, I continue to like them, even though I felt that they were both a little bit shallow in one sense.
Yeah, I mean, Jack, I was back and forth on Jack throughout, but we can sort of, I'm sure we'll cover some of that. But they sort of do overcome, I think, that initial set of reservations about a character, because you even get like, whilst the uprising is happening, they're staying in some fancy hotel, a luxury suite. It kind of feels very weird and artificial in this world. But once they sort of leave that, so there is a really, I think, very cool piece of technology which Jack is using, where he's actually sort of hacked into these kind of fly drones, and they've all got cameras.
Yeah.
And the way I imagined it, based on how it was described, is almost like a fly's eye, which has loads of lenses. So you can see from 1,000 different perspectives at the same time when you're looking at like surveillance imagery. And I thought that was really cool. And you can have these spy drones flying around, going into anywhere. That maybe that is one way that ultimately they sort of are getting followed later on as well with this kind of surveillance. So that was very cool. Higher technology than you normally see in 40K, probably later on. But because it's in the civilian space and the Inquisitor
I think so.
space,
I'm trying to compare
it
with reading Eisenhorn. And it felt like it was in the same space.
Right.
And maybe, Abnett's obviously mentioned his Ian Watson's work, hasn't he?
Yes, he has.
So I wonder, you could see I think the influence there, the good bits of the way that the Inquisition was working in that small team. I mean, it's almost like a small spy drama thing. It was like watching Spooks, isn't it? And I like it, and I worked. And there are elements in the Eisenhorn stories that are like that. And there were things that were used in it that I think that were kept. What's the truth drug? Was it Veritas serum or something?
That's right.
That stayed. That's a thing. And I imagine Ian Watson's named that and come up with that, because I can't imagine it might be in the Rogue Trader rulebook.
It could be, but it
might
feels
be.
Like
I don't know, but it feels like something he's come up with. Well, that's a thing. That's canon now. That's in Abnett's Eisenhorn books for sure. So that's good, and I could feel the connection there, and I think the story worked really well for those points. It felt like a proper 40K Inquisition team, and they're all so different. There's so much character based on the Inquisitor themselves, and it felt like that Eisenhorn could meet Jack Draco,
right?
And it would work. You could imagine them conversing.
Well, you do get, because there's quite a fun approach to the Inquisitors themselves. They have their own retinues, they have their own sense of style, they're kind of approaching it in their own way. We see another Inquisitor who's on the planet to deal with those Genestealers, and that's Hark Obispal, who is kind of a very different character. One of the only other characters to have dedicated new art in the illustrated version of the book, which is quite fun. He sort of looks pretty cool. So you kind of get that. And I also like the world itself and the way in which the world was described. So both this being a jungle world that's kind of got these almost like barrier reef kind of hive cities that have been built out as kind of, imagine the Sydney Opera House, but on an enormous scale. That's quite cool. And the way in which people move around these places, and the just the scale of it all, it being enormous, was great fun, I thought. Like, that really sold 40K to me.
All of that stuff was very good.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we get the sort of start of the plot proper, which kind of, it begins with the appearance of this sort of taunting figure, Zephyro Carnelian, who has, and I love this conceit, he has hacked into, psychically, the Emperor's Tarot that Jack is using to sort of divine the future and sort of help him, because it's a tarot card deck that is connected to the Emperor. It's kind of got a certain amount of psychic essence from the Emperor, and it's unique to Jack Draco, and every Inquisitor would have one and would use it for their own purposes. But his Jack Draco's has been hacked by a person he doesn't know at the start, and he's taken over the Harlequin card, so the actual Eldar Harlequin card. So he's called the Harlequin Man at first, and he's teasing Jack, and he kind of wants him to follow him, and the team follow the trail down into the Underhive, essentially, and then they discover this thing that's the Hydra that you mentioned before. So it's a I don't want to say a literal Hydra, but it's kind of a being, an alienoid kind of entity that has infested the Underhive, taken over the whole world. These kind of tendrils, kind of, I don't know, Cthulhu-esque, maybe even living kind
definitely of Cthulhu-esque. I imagine that's
made of the warp, but not quite. It's got this immaterium built, whatever it is. It's almost alien in the sense of you can't quite comprehend what it is.
Yeah,
it's this kind of growth.
Fully regenerative. It can regenerate, can't it?
Yeah.
So you open a case, you can cut a bit off, shut the case, use it, and it will regrow. It's this endless supply.
Absolutely magical. In every way.
A demon spirit and a child's slime goo.
Very much so. Yeah, and it's because it's the way in which it's described as sort of, these sort of slug-like kind of tendrils and all this. This sort of it's almost like a growth that a sort of malignant growth that's taking over the planet, and it has this kind of psychic relationship with where it's being controlled by Zephyr Carnelian and his colleagues, and ultimately we'll later learn that the plan for this Hydra, and it's a big plan, but it is that they're going to use it to almost embed in everybody's mind in the entire Imperium a sort of seed, if you like, of Hydra that at some point will sprout and then will allow someone to take psychic control of literally every single human so that they can become drones, essentially.
Yes.
And they will just be psychically controlled. So it's this idea of, it's almost the nth level absurd conclusion of the level of control, sort of, oppression that the Imperium wants over its people, but just taking that all the way to its conclusion. And whether or not this is the Emperor's design becomes a sort of a key plot point and all this sort of stuff. But it's an enormous kind of plot. You start from something very small, which is hanging out in a luxury suite whilst there's a Genestealer cult uprising, to the entire universe and the minds of everyone in it are up for grabs. And it all starts with Zephyr Carnelian. I mean, what were your thoughts, Stu, on him, as a character?
I don't know if I have any really strong thoughts, to be honest with you. I think it worked. I think it's a strange story, isn't it? It's very strange. Like I said, I think my view on it is definitely tainted by what I think is the origins of some of the names and things used for future stories. And the Hydra in Heresy doesn't mean this thing,
like a literal Hydra thing.
Yeah, but it's the idea, I think, of almost the secret cabal and club and secret power and a secret society kind of thing. That's changed brought forward or backwards, I suppose, because it's 30k, but you know what I mean. It's the idea of it feels familiar. So I like that side of it. But if you remove that, is it just a weird warp alien and at its most basic form? And could there have been a better story to tell if you're going to be really, really harsh? It's a slimy tentacle thing that's not a thing. Is it warp? Isn't it? I don't know. The plan seems overly ambitious, doesn't it? So it almost feels like that. Well, the threat is such a long way off. What were we talking at the time? Was it 1 million worlds? Is it 1 billion worlds now? I don't know.
Sure.
It was still
1 million worlds, I think, back then.
Yeah. So it almost feels like, this is the plan is for the future. It won't be us though, because we'll be dead. It'll be future people almost. So it's interesting in that sense, but also, does that take away the immediate kind of danger and jeopardy?
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think one of the things the novel does quite well is that sense of enormous scale, absurd scale. And you get some of that through, there's kind of a time dilation, which I feel has changed now. But when you go into the warp and you're traveling for, let's say, 2 weeks, you could come out and it would be 5 years later. So the actual traveling between planets through the warp was this enormous amount of time. So traveling as Jack Draco does, he goes from Stalinvest, the world that they start on, to Space Hulk in the middle of nowhere, to the Eye of Terror, and then from the Eye of Terror all the way to Holy Terror. So he goes to Earth. Yeah. In terms of the actual travel time, it might have taken him, let's say, a month of flying, but that would actually be 20 or 30 years of real time.
Yes, yeah.
And that kind of gives it this interesting... the sense of scale isn't just the literal physical scale of how big a building is. It's also the sense of scale through time. And I quite like that. I think that's quite big because it is so ambitious and such an absurd plan overall. Because, you're going to infect every single world with this weird little alien thing. And then that's going to grow to cover the entire planet with nobody noticing. And then it's going to infect every single person. Like, it's huge. They're really swinging for big results. But
warp-induced Japanese knotweed. It's
exactly, absolutely, completely. And the creature is gross. I mean, it's the way it's described. It did one of the. So I think some of Watson's best work is this kind of grossness, and he loves the lurid details, and you get some of that when we go to a Slaneshi planet and stuff like that.
Yeah,
the actual descriptions of this gross kind of slug thing, they were gross, and they were quite unsettling, and they had that psychic impact on me. So, like, reading about, there's a bit later on when Melindy eats some of it, and it felt very uncomfortable to read. It was really well done to make it feel gross and disgusting.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it was gross. I don't know. I find slug. Yeah, if I was watching it, I might think, but I don't know. I don't find that kind of thing that gross, I suppose.
Maybe I've just got a weaker stomach than you.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe I don't know. I'm trying to think what. This sounds really bad, but what kind of thing disturbs me in that way? Sure. Maybe body horror kind of stuff more so than things like that.
And there's a moment actually of not quite body horror, but there is a moment when they are going onto the Space Hulk, and the Hydra, it sort of comes in, all the tendrils rapidly come into the corridor with them, or the room with them, and then they start shooting it and vaporizing it and doing so much damage to it that it liquefies it. But then it just keeps coming. It's still alive and it's still active, and it then just almost floods the entire room with liquid form.
It's a good scene. And you feel the jeopardy in that, but I suppose I just don't. Yeah, I didn't. I can see it's gross and you wouldn't want it touching you, but I'm also I don't know. I don't get that same kind of revulsion as I would do from The Thing, the film The Thing, and that kind of stuff. That's probably what made me. I enjoy it still. Maybe I'm just sick, but that's the kind of thing that makes me think, oh, that's a bit more gross. Would I rather touch that big slug thing than the spider-headed thing from The Thing? Yeah,
I guess because it's earlier on in the. Yeah, I mean, The Thing, because I would kind of see it on the Thing spectrum, actually. It could easily be the same kind of creature, but it doesn't mutate into the grossness of those kind of spider creatures or what have you in The Thing. It just stays in its kind of slug form.
Yeah. It feels like the blob kind of.
Yeah, and it is used in another uncomfortable scene that I think is quite difficult, I suppose, to talk about and kind of really explore. But it's definitely an important scene to consider. So that is that Zephyro Carnelian actually uses the Hydra creature, or the entity, I suppose, to attack Melindy. And he kind of pins her down, and then he essentially, there's a sort of psychic sexual assault is probably a way of describing it. And that's quite an uncomfortable scene, I think. And there's a lot of understandable discussion of that sequence online and whether or not it was effective and appropriate and all that sort of stuff. There's a kind of justification later on in the story about, because we know Melindy is physically very capable, physically very strong, and she's emotionally very locked down, I guess, because she has completely sacrificed herself and her own desires for to be an assassin, to be a Callidus assassin, and for the Emperor. And what
Yeah.
we get in this sequence is the idea that Zephyro Carnelian is essentially using pleasure as a weapon and unlocking some of those desires that she's had to lock away.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting idea there. I don't think it was necessary, and I don't think it quite works in that way in the book.
No, I've got probably quite a lot of views on it. It just wasn't needed, to be honest with you, and it's nothing to do with me being prudish towards it. And far from it. The first point and the most basic form is that what were these? Who were these books aimed at? And I think that as a theme, it shouldn't be for that kind of teen, that kind of 15 to 18-year-olds. I'm not really sure that should be the target market. I don't think it fits Games Workshop at any era. And the people who were aiming their games at, and these were obviously a companion to games, it just doesn't fit. So I'm not saying you shouldn't tread at all into any of those kind of themes. And we've already said that later on there is a sexual scene between Melindy and Jack, and that was absolutely fine. That's human nature, should happen. But this felt like violence, and because of that, I just don't know if it really needed to be in a book. It should be, absolutely in a novel, it's science fiction novel, challenging, yes, but not maybe one in a Warhammer novel. It just didn't feel that it had its place for it there. And then I suppose all of the arguments for why it may be needed. And I'm saying this as a man, but it does feel like the kind of things that a man might say. Well, this was her only weakness, and it's just like, sure. Really, and that's maybe a 2024 viewpoint on it more. But I just felt it was meant to be titillating, and it was clumsy, and it was a shame, because I think that it's left a bit of a mark more than the other parts sort of talked about, that those elements spoil the story a little bit more for me, rather than just a little bit of pacing or something. Don't get me wrong, it's not horrendous. It feels like I'm over-egging it, but I don't think it was needed at all, and I don't think it added much to the story. And there could have been another. It's a psychic attack, and you could have made that attack still without making it a sexual attack.
Yeah,
just her having nightmares or something. Tapped into the short story, making her believe that she changed to steal form and could never change back again. That was the psyche, her weakness in the first story. So that we've already set up what her biggest fears and her biggest regrets is, the change in her life, the change in her ability to be all those things that she could be before. You could have easily tapped into that. And again, I felt like it was there for different reasons.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you've said there. Yeah, there were other ways to tackle it, and given the sexual language around Melindy as a character throughout the book, it does kind of reduce her role from being, she is the only one who's physically capable in a fight out of pretty much everybody. Some of them are all right with guns, but she's very much written to be the sort of the combatant, the physical member of the team in that way. And you reduce a lot of that down to just the fact that she's an attractive woman, and I think this adds to that and kind of undermines her further. And it undermines some of the later, it's not a love story necessarily, but the kind of physical connection and the emotional connection that she ends up having with Jack Draco is also undermined by this earlier sequence. Yes. And I agree. I think for the audience that this was intended for, and for the way in which it's written, it is clumsy, and it kind of does feel like it's supposed to be titillating rather than revelatory, and kind of it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't do enough to add anything that you couldn't have added another way. So I agree. I think a misstep, I would say, at that point in the story. But from there, we then we do go to the Space Hulk, and we do find out the hidden cabal within the Inquisition. I mean, cults within cults, that's very 40k. That's good stuff.
Yeah,
I think
it
that
all
works
works.
really well. And there's a great sequence when Jack Draco is meeting the cult, and they kind of blank everybody else out because all four of them have gone into this. Well, it's actually an extra person that we'll talk about in a minute who's gone with them, but you kind of get this. There's a hour long, I think he says, explanation. There's just an exposition dump that Jack Draco gets about the Hidden Order and the secret mission and the Hydra. But I quite like that you get these sort of revelations of the Inquisitor who was on the planet earlier turns out to be a member of this Hidden Order. And so does Jack Draco's boss, who has sent him on the mission in the first place. But then there's a few people, these high lords of this Hydra hidden Inquisition, who never reveal their faces, and I quite like that as a detail.
Yeah, I loved all this bit. This was good.
Extra level of just like creepy sort of conspiracy stuff. The extra character who has joined them was Mama Parsheen, who is the astropath who Jack Draco ends up using in order to order an exterminatus for the Stalinverse planet. So there's an interesting sequence of events where Zephyr Carnelian is kind of like, oh, this Hydra's here. It's going to do some dodgy stuff. What are you going to do about it, Jack? And then he kind of just goes, all right, well, he agonizes about it a bit because he doesn't want to kill everybody on a planet, understandably. But then he decides he's going to. And the only person who could send a message that far is the actual governor's astropath. So that's who he goes to see. And we're introduced to this character, this old lady, Mama Parsheen, who sends the message, and then there's the kind of the appearance of the spy drones, the fly drones again, where Zephyr Carnelian's been listening in. So Jack decides to not exterminate the planet, calls it off. They take Mama Parsheen with them, and they go off to the Space Hulk, and sort of she's able to track Zephyr Carnelian for them. And I thought that was really cool. So Carnelian has hacked the spy drones, and through the spy drones, this psyker, Mama Parsheen, is then able to do a sort of trace back and plant a homing beacon in Zephyr Carnelian, and they can follow him to this space. Hole. That's cool.
This stuff's all really good.
Yeah.
This is all the stuff that's kind of espionage, kind of that very 40k in describing her well-being. And she wanted to be free of her job as on that planet as well. So she was excited to be kind of stolen and used. And it's all very 40k with the espionage parts in excellent stuff. Yeah. And it's even more 40k when we found out that she decided not to cancel the message. I mean,
yes.
So message sent, saw the blue ticks, then did unsend afterwards, but it was too late. Everyone's already read it. But it's really interesting that she deliberately left that, didn't recall that message, even though they all think she has, because she wants to get revenge on the planet that she feels that she's been kind of almost imprisoned on. She hasn't either. It's very interesting, but very, very 40k, and I loved it. Very, very good.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the like you say, the sci-fi surveillance and espionage stuff, absolutely brilliant. It's when the book is at its best for me. All of this kind of the cat and mouse game with Carnelian, the technology, the psychic interactions with that technology. I love that kind of thing. I think it's really inventive, interesting stuff that you don't get to see often enough, I think, really. And I also really like the fact that she didn't send the cancel on the exterminatus. And again, it speaks to the scale of things. So she just wants revenge on the governor who has imprisoned her, basically, and the way in which she's been forced to live as a slave her entire life because she has this psychic gift. And the way in which she gets revenge isn't just by getting the governor killed. She will destroy the entire planet and everybody on it, including her pet cat. So it's just like that fully is 40k, sort of the scale of vengeance as you would see it in the 41st millennium. So I think it was a
Martha
great
pop up there when you said killing pet cat there. Just
No, I would never let it happen. We're not exterminating the Earth whilst Martha's on it. No way. Yeah, it's a great moment, and then we actually get that the Zephyr Carnelian then executes her summarily because she did destroy Stalinverse, which I thought was a really surprising moment as well. It works really well.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And there's a payback to that in the epilogue as well, which is
Yeah.
good. So that was all really strong storytelling, I think, and good plot building. And at that stage, the story's working very well. That main story arc, the plot, the cabal, all of the espionage around it, the different layers and the people they're meeting, very 40k and good. And that's why it's so disappointing when some of the other sort of inter-character play is so sided towards a certain thing, because it just takes away and spoils some of those really strong storytelling parts.
Yeah. What did you think then of the sort of next sequence? Because it's a little bit episodic, but they go from the Space Hulk. They then decide instantly, despite the fact that Draco has pledged his allegiance to the Hydra and this hidden secret mission, he then doesn't believe in it. So he wants to go and find out where the Hydra has been created, and he thinks that's in the Eye of Terror. So they go to a planet that they think is where the Hydra was actually bioengineered. And that ends up being a Slaneshi planet. There's Slanesh worshippers. There's
It wasn't going to be another god, was it? To be honest with you,
I mean, what was your thoughts on that sort of section?
I didn't. It was fine. It changed again. Maybe it was one of the problems with the pacing at times. It felt a little bit like it went from an espionage movie to a kind of an 80s film. It was a little bit funny when they turn up and they see all these mutants, but it felt a little bit like some of the fantasy books. It's very, I suppose, again, if he's reading Realm of Chaos, that kind of thing, you're going to get that feeling. But it's the old Chaos Space Marine or something, but it felt a little bit mismatched and a little bit weird. I don't mind it. I kind of almost expected a book of its age to have that kind of description of chaos. Whether it helped the story or not, I don't know. I think you could have probably removed that whole section and the story would have maybe been better for it. But I didn't mind this section on its own. Maybe it would have made a nice little short story as a Jack Draco short story when they visited this chaos planet in it. Obviously, it was a Slanesh planet, wasn't it? So that was indulged a little bit.
Yes, it was,
but much more harmlessly, I would say. Whereas the last part we talked about was potentially problematic. This would have made a 14, 15-year-old boy giggle at times. When they find out where they can't torture this being because she obviously enjoys it too much, but the best way was to remove the nipple rings, and as the breast deflates, and it's almost like, oh no, don't do that because you're taking away my pleasure pain sort of sense. It's cheeky, again, not probably needed, but it wasn't gratuitous or even slightly dark with it. It was more in the Brian Craig levels of cheekiness rather than the slightly more kind of male focused on Melindy. It was a different kind of sexually cheekiness, shall we say, is 80s 90s Slanesh rather than the modern version of it, which is a little bit more obviously a little bit more vanilla.
I think you're right. I think there is a sort of pacing problem with this section because it does kind of change speed and tone as well. And you're on a sort of Star Trek away mission at this point where they kind of don disguises and they're running around trying to fight people. Yeah. It kind of reminded me a little bit. It's not as good, but it reminded me a little bit of the Laughter of the Dark Gods, so the William King story in the Chaos Wastes, where you kind of got these war bands and the different kinds of chaos that you encounter. But it didn't have the sort of weight of that in quite the same way, because you get like there's a duel that takes place where Melindy has to fight 3 people for some reason, and things just kind of slow down a little bit, and you kind of
dialogue's odd as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I was questioning the logic that Jack was like, oh, I guess I'll sign up to this random duel and I'll agree with these rules. And
it's I don't even know if it's supposed to be awkward, because Melindy changes into Stealer form so that she might look a little bit chaotic.
Yes.
But there's a way to kind of make more sense of that when they first encounter these chaos beings. Jack said it was almost like, we're chaos because that's my lover. And it's kind of like, I'm mad me. Look at my girl. It's like, honestly, we are chaos. Look how dirty our uniforms are that we've just scuffed up. And it's a little bit, they're going to see right through that, aren't they? Because that's terrible. And aren't you supposed to be an agent of the Imperium, a really talented Inquisitor, but you've kind of just donned the worst fancy dress disguises and pretending to be we're chaos, really. Yeah. Up corn. I mean, Slanesh, who was it around here? It's kind of, it feels almost Monty Python-esque.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think so. I would recommend everybody who enjoys these kind of books and these kinds of discussions check out the Oldhammer Fiction podcast, because Lewis, at the end of each of his fantastic readings of these stories, also does a bit of analysis. And I won't go into all the details of his piece about this one, but I did think there were some really interesting points that he made just around this fear here of, so the description of Queen Melania, Melania, I guess, the sort of leader of the Slanesh cult on this planet, is that she is this kind of corpulent, massive, overweight kind of creature. There's a really interesting through line there of the sort of fear of fatness that exists within this. And I think there's something to be explored there. I think there is merit in exploring it as a part of Slanesh, because it goes beyond just the sort of traditional, the sex as deviance that Slanesh often sort of gets reduced to. So I think excess and debauchery in many forms is quite an interesting thing to explore. So I would recommend Lewis's thoughts on that. The other thing that he does say in there as well, which I think is great, is just the way in which the world here is described. Some of the buildings are described as almost copulating with one another, like their form. Yeah. And of course, that's a sort of very Watsonian description. But then that comes back into play when we go to Terra and when we go to Earth. Similar descriptions are used there. And there's also, and spoilers for the end of the story, the same lack of answers that you would find on this world as they find on Earth. So from the Chaos guys, they get no new information. They don't find out if the Hydra was created here. They don't find out what was happening or who's responsible or whether the Emperor is behind this whole thing. And then when they get to Earth, they similarly walk away with basically no answers, having just been through the same kind of thing. So yes, I can't take credit for some of those thoughts.
It's a good challenge to the idea of the Imperium of Man being...
It's really interesting.
As we all see them today, if you still love 40k universe fiction today, we know that they aren't good.
Sure.
This is kind of an early way of questioning, are they good? And the Imperium was different back then. It was Space Marines were different back then. They were much more military-esque, weren't they? They were superhuman, but they weren't quite 8-10 foot superhuman. They felt a little bit more like special forces with power armor rather than this completely superhuman idea. And I feel a little bit more like the police force of the when you look at the pictures in Rogue Trader, and there's all those kind of graffiti walls and stuff. And it was a different world back then, but Watson here is almost putting the same question on the Imperium that you would today. Well, actually, they're clearly not the good guys. Are they any better than Chaos? They're just a different form of ruler or power. That's good. That works now. So that was good from it. But I'm not sure that maybe that whole scene was to set that up at the end. And that's what he was trying to do. But maybe you could have made that a bit shorter.
It could have probably been more elegant in his execution, if that was the intention.
Yeah.
But yes, they basically learn nothing, so they have to go to Earth to have a conversation with the Emperor. Now, this is mentioned on the back of the book, so this is coming. I was really worried that this was going to be something that really shrank the world, because the Emperor is so important to the fiction and the background of 40k, but you can't really spend any time with him because it has to be the backdrop and the stories take place elsewhere. Because if you bring if your story goes to the Emperor, then it kind of makes everything really small, because you can go from the Eye of Terror to then go and have a conversation with the Emperor. That doesn't feel like innumerable worlds and all of this stuff happening all the time, every single day. That feels like a main character can go and see everybody, like every named character can hang out together. So I was
you shouldn't be having
worried
conversations with a god.
Yeah.
And we know he's not really a god, but you're not supposed to know that.
Sure.
And the especially an Inquisitor who's absolutely, drinking the Kool-Aid when it comes to this. The thought of I'll go and have a word and see what he says, it feels too accessible. He's not the CEO. He is a god. I mean, the amount of Inquisitors there are, he probably couldn't even get to speak to the CEO. So it does feel a little bit over-egged in that sense. And again, I'll draw another comparison to the Horus Heresy series, is how few times that you see the Emperor, and you don't really get him speaking until much later in the story, and that's really powerful.
Yeah,
because you need him to be something far removed, something you can't imagine almost. And when you find out again more about him, stuff I know you haven't read, when you find out more of the what is now canon origins stories and things, it's amazing how it all fits in with this earlier stuff. But it's great and it's amazing. But yeah, it's to go there and do anything other than see a corpse on a throne, that's all you should see. You shouldn't really be able to engage with him at all, and you probably shouldn't be a powerful enough psyker to be able to have a conversation
just
with
melt
him anyway.
Your mind, right?
So yeah, I did struggle with that. I liked the scenes up to it. I liked how long they had to spend almost hiding in terror. They really got the scale of almost the city planet, how all the different layers of the defense and this. It was probably a little bit too easy to get into the throne room. I mean, I don't know how you do that. You just
so I quite like this, because this was part of the sort of concern as well, is that how would you even do it? But I feel like Watson made the characters pay to get in.
Yeah.
So there's a very, very cool, again, space sort of espionage stuff where they actually have to close that circle on the black ships that we've heard about, and they smuggle themselves in as a test of whether or not things are being smuggled in. So Jack convinces another Inquisitor and another captain to put him and his team in stasis and then let them deposit them inside the palace. I thought that was great. That was such a cool way into the palace in the first place. And then the actual journey to get to the throne was, we don't know how long it took, but it must be weeks, maybe months that they spent there. They talk about losing their own minds almost, and they lost a sense of self because they had to pretend to be gang members. They had to pretend to be members of the ecclesiarchy or random scribes. Or at one point, there's a great line where they talk about that Jack had to pretend to be an Inquisitor, and then he realized he was one because he'd forgotten, because it'd taken so long for him to actually make that journey to the throne. And then they don't quite explain how you get in. So the Emperor leads them, or someone leads them through the tarot to the throne room, which I quite liked as a conceit, and then froze time so that they could flit around and make their way in. But you don't actually, it's not like you see them then open a door. They just get in somehow.
And that's the weird bit, because I liked
weird,
all of it.
But I quite liked that.
I liked all of it
rather than
up to that. Yeah, I suppose you had to find a way for them to get in a situation where they probably wouldn't ever be able to get in.
Well, because you have the stairs,
that a little bit.
Yeah, and you have the Titans that stand astride the actual door and all of that sort of the custodies. All of this is mentioned. So it being a sort of magic way in didn't bother me too much. I think that's probably better than they managed to convince a guard or something.
Threw a stone into the corner and the custodians went like that.
Yeah, and then you do get that audience with with the emperor, an emperor? What was your sort of
Yeah,
read on the emperor
I
conversation?
don't know if I liked it. Maybe, but for the reasons I've already said, that
Mm,
I'd like to think that it wasn't the emperor that he was speaking to, because then
sure.
that kind of fits in with the, and hopefully that's what we'll find out in later stories, is that he didn't have a mental conversation. And I mean, when I mean mental, I mean, well, probably in both senses, because it was a strange conversation, but
Yes.
it just felt a little bit too familiar. And I hope that we find out that it's almost within his own mind and he maybe didn't have that conversation, or it's someone from the cabal that has somehow
So
faked that conversation or something. I don't know. It's you still didn't find out anything, but I don't know if I like the idea that it was a conversation with the emperor, if that's what it turns out to be.
and I think there's more than enough wiggle room in here. And the way it's sort of
Mm.
described is that he's actually, to my mind, he's having a conversation with the 1,000 psychers who are being sacrificed to the
Yes,
emperor.
yeah.
Because they talk about being a sort of hive mind, and they talk
Mm.
about having, there's an argument amongst themselves. So the way I kind of took it was that the sacrificed psychers think or feel or have been convinced or convinced themselves that they have been sacrificed to to the emperor, to the god, and that they are now sort of, part of him. And
Yeah.
actually, what it could be is just that they are a collective psychic field that's constantly being replenished. So every time
Hmm.
new psychers are sacrificed, they just make up the numbers in this kind of web of psychers, and
Yeah.
they keep the Astronomicon going, and they are also able to then have conversations like this, and they've kind of tricked themselves into believing that they are the emperor or part of the emperor. And
Yeah.
so I think that works quite nicely, because then that keeps the mystique of the god and the emperor. Maybe they are part of the emperor, maybe they're not, and it's just some sort of weird thing.
Hmm. Yeah,
But you
that
can do it
works. That
all.
works. But yeah, I like to think that he wasn't talking to any consciousness of
Yeah,
them.
not like the true emperor
Yeah.
is like literally having a conversation with him.
Yeah, well, even even psychically, I don't
Yeah.
think that will, especially with what the emperor is actually doing there, because all
Did
he's
you get
doing
any
is
sense of closure or like revelation from the conversation with the emperor?
not
Did you
really. It
really?
felt like it was getting there, but then it kind of almost deliberately left it open, and I can understand why you would do that. Maybe he
Hmm.
hadn't decided as well. We don't know whether he's already mapped it out as a trilogy or not at that stage. Who knows? Be interesting when we get to the next story to find out whether it's part of the same story arc, or whether he's off doing something else.
Yeah, I mean it's because they sold the book. The very first printing does mention that this is the first in a trilogy of stories, so it must have been known that there would be sequels.
Hmm.
I think for me, as much as you want to keep a conversation with a purported god vague and kind of, open to interpretation, it just felt like there wasn't enough of anything to the conversation. It was so open to interpretation that I can't imagine that Draco would have left feeling anything but disappointed at having been through all of that for basically nothing. What I did think was interesting, though, was that Draco acknowledges that Grimm seems to have had a different conversation,
Hmm.
because Grimm says to him, "What, didn't you get it? Well, now it's time to go." And Jack is like, "Oh, well, maybe he heard something different that was much clearer." So I quite
Hmm.
liked that idea that everybody who was there was having their own separate conversation and getting a
Yeah.
different direction. And maybe because Jack Draco is plagued by indecision and a crisis of faith, his conversation was a lot more nebulous, and he needs to work through it. That's the conversation he had to have. Whereas Grimm maybe got like, go and fix the engine
Yeah.
or something.
It's a sale on WD-40. Come on, we gotta go.
Yeah.
They close in a couple of hours. Okay.
Yeah. So like that I thought was fun. But then they do kind of, that not only does the conversation come to an abrupt end, the story kind of came to an abrupt end as well,
Yeah.
I felt.
Yeah. I mean, where'd you go from that anyway? It felt like it ran out of pace in
I mean,
terms.
it's a big ending, right? Yeah, we went to
It felt
Earth,
like the
spent
right
a
time,
month,
especially as it's a trilogy. If we are carrying that story on, which it probably is, then it makes sense. I mean, you've got an epilogue after that as well, which kind of does come in and tie up a few things and also ask a few more questions to encourage the reader to want to continue and on and find out more, which I suppose is a really good point that you are going to find out more.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, there is the epilogue, because that epilogue is set 100 years in the future.
Yeah.
So again, one assumes some warp travel, and you've gone through the warp, and then it's taken however long to get where you're going. But that's a librarian and an inquisitor having a conversation about the text we've just read and whether or not it's accurate and what it really happened, and was Jack Draco covering for himself. And that's where you get your, like you mentioned before, you close the loop on the Stalin-versed exterminators, because Draco is a wanted man because
he's blamed for it. He's blamed for rather than her, which is interesting. Which, I suppose the only certainty from that would be that the power of the cabal would have said, well, we don't know who this mama is. We're not executed her. What are you on about? Never heard of her.
Yeah, exactly. She's not important enough to be a part of the event, right? She just sent the message. So it was Draco who wanted the message sent, didn't recall it, and because presumably he is now felt to have betrayed the hidden
cabal
order.
Then why wouldn't you say, well, he's rogue, clearly. He's exterminated this planet. Yeah, don't listen to him.
Exactly.
Cabal, what are you on about?
Exactly.
I don't even like tentacles.
Yeah, because we don't learn anything more about the Hydra and what it really is. We don't learn where it came from. We don't learn if the Emperor is behind this mission. What we do learn is that this random Inquisitor at the end of the story just shoots the librarian dead. So they seem to be having a friendly conversation, and then he assassinates him. So that then becomes the setup, I think, for where the Inquisition War goes next. There's even the line, the Inquisition War has begun. So we kind of get this. What does that mean? Where's Jack Draco in all of this? How is this going to resolve? Has the Hydra continued to grow, or have things changed in those 100 years?
Yeah, it's good. I see that was the epilogue made it a very strong ending, and reminds me of the really good parts of the bits, the story, the really strong parts. So
yeah. I read a review somewhere, and I forget where it was, but I'll try and find it and put a link in the description. But they basically said that they think it's a great book, but not necessarily a good one, because there's so many amazing moments and so many cool ideas. But could you recommend it as a book to read? Could you recommend it as a primer on the 41st millennium, or just a good story? I don't know that I could recommend it on those bases.
No, there's too many bits that I would feel like I would need to forewarn a reader.
Yeah, you'd have to caveat a lot of it, right?
Which is a shame, because I feel like you could remove nearly all of those slightly odd parts, and you've got a decent story there. You'd have to add stuff back because it'd be too short, but I think you could explore extending some of the good scenes and maybe just exploring the other characters and not doing it all from Jack's perspective. Obviously, the overall story can be, but you can switch between characters' perspectives in a book, and by delving a little bit more into the character development of Melindy and Gugal and Grimm, you would fill that word count. They would be fuller, more likable characters. Then we'd be even more excited about seeing what happens in the next story. At the same time, you get rid of those bits that maybe aren't so desirable in the story, or the focus, at least. Anyway, the focus becomes more on their characters and their backgrounds, because we don't know anything about. We know about Melindy because of the short story.
Yeah.
You should be able to read this story in isolation. And I wonder how we'd feel about Melindy have we not already read the short story.
Yeah.
How much? I mean, I still like her character, but maybe it's because of that short story. And and Grimm and Google are just very, very shallow characters for a novel. They almost feel as shallow as you'd find them in a film. where a novel normally will add that sort of extra layers of detail and complexity. But we will
Yeah,
see whether that develops more over the next two.
I agree. Yeah, and I think overall there are some moments of great writing in this book. There are ideas that I absolutely loved. You know, I talk about some of them with the technology or the espionage or the sense of how vast and scary and confusing the 41st millennium is. All of that stuff really worked for me. This is absolutely a version of the 40K setting that I really liked and I could
Yeah,
spend a lot more time in. So,
he
and this
got
is
it.
the
He gets
40K universe that
40K.
you would want to role play in, for
Yeah.
instance, right? So there's
Yes.
loads of stories to tell here. I think this particular story with these particular characters doesn't quite exploit it throughout. So at times they work, at times it's great. As a sort of, if I wasn't already interested in 40K and I wasn't already interested in Rogue Trader and I wasn't already interested in Watson and GW Books as a project, would I be interested in this just as a book? Probably not. It doesn't stand above all of the parts that I really like.
Yeah.
So I couldn't
Same.
recommend it to anybody. I don't think, but I did like it, sort of despite its flaws, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think when you asked me what my grading of
Well,
it,
go for it.
that's
Thumbs up,
that
thumbs
I'm
down.
really conflicted
Yeah.
because like you, I have lots of issues with it. I think he gets 40K. I think at the heart of it, he gets the deep dark Imperium part of 40K rather than the shiny combat Space Marine legions and chapters and Imperial Guard 40K. He gets that darker, dirtier, grim Eisenhorn style 40K, which is brilliant. But yeah, some of it's just not good. And I think I'll give it a thumbs up in the context of what we're doing as exploring this series. The same as you, I wouldn't, if we remove it from the context of enjoying learning about these early books, then I'll be the same. It would be a different result. So for people who are interested in almost the history of the development of the Warhammer worlds and their stories, then yes, it's a thumbs up. Go and read it because you will enjoy learning and exploring it. If you're a more modern experiencer of Warhammer or not at all, then there are many other things that you should go and read, not this.
Sure. And yeah, I think I can see that. And I would give it a thumbs up. I think I look forward to revisiting it one day, sort of having read it now. Because it obviously stood, a lot of it had sort of there's a mystique and a kind of, it's talked about in hushed whispers and loud whispers here and there. You know, it's a terrible novel or over the top, or it's got these problems, and a lot of that is true at times. But what's not talked about as much as I think should be is just how good the good bits are. So when it's firing on all cylinders, when it's just pure sci-fi creativity, it's fantastic. It's so good. It just goes off the rails here and there, and then the rails themselves, you know, if that's the plot, are just a bit. They're just a bit odd. They're a bit wonky. It's the story it is telling is just not necessarily like the best story you could have told, I guess.
No, I mean I mean we're going around in circles a little bit here, but even the parts of Jack looking back in the past, they're actually good, but they probably should have been concentrated more towards the front of the story as part of the getting to know the characters. And if we had similar, maybe shortened a little bit, they're a little bit too lengthy. And some of that time spent doing the same for the other characters in that first quarter of the book, I think it would have really changed. That becomes the setup. The setup was too long before we got the switch to the main story arc.
I did wonder.
That could have been a lot quicker.
Yeah.
And you could have explored that on the journey a little bit more. And that would have been really good. And then you could have stuck with this main story arc, which we're in now, which is actually really interesting. And I think it would have gone from some bits of this I really like to, wow, this is a really good story that stands up with modern 40k fiction. But yeah, it definitely gives you a weird kind of mix of what's good and what's bad about Warhammer 40,000, I think.
Yes, it does. And I wondered, based on the short story Warped Stars, where we get an Inquisitor and Grim saving a young boy who is destined to be a powerful psyker and be drafted into the Inquisition. I wondered if that was going to turn out to be Jack Draco. So the character that we'd seen as a young boy.
That would have been good, wouldn't it?
I'm surprised it wasn't. Again, because Grim is there, and you could have explained the relationship with Grim. He's kind of, because Grim, obviously, he's a squat, so they live longer. He's
it still could be. But why you wouldn't? But why you wouldn't deliver that payoff until now? Yeah. I don't know.
It would explain more of the relationship with Grim that Jack could have, and I think it would have, because Warped Stars I thought was a really fun story, some really cool ideas in that as well. That would have worked for Jack in the same way that the Melindy story, The Alien Beast Within, gave us a lot more sort of background to her as a character and a sort of likability to her from that. So yeah, I did wonder about that. The other thing I was just curious about, Stu, was what your so in the art that was done, so John Blanche did a couple of pieces for the book, one of which includes a picture of Jack Draco, which was inspired by Sean Connery. So it's I mean, did you imagine Sean Connery as Jack Draco throughout this story? Did you have those Connery vibes?
No, I didn't. I do love all of those, that era of art where you can quite clearly see certain film characters' faces in there. So no, I didn't. And I'm aware well of that artwork. And you know what? I don't know if I pictured Jack Draco very well. I think
he was younger for me.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes a character I picture fully. I can almost imagine their face, and I'm only thinking about this now as we're saying this. As you asked me, I'm not sure I really pictured him.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly get that.
I don't know what that says about maybe the writing. I mean, it's quite the character I can really picture, so bizarrely enough, was Melindy, because she was described an awful lot. So yeah, I don't know if I pictured him, and I'm sure he was described, but I definitely he didn't stick in my mind in any sense.
Sure. Zephyro Carnelian, I think was described fairly well as well.
Yeah.
As, you know, he's wearing his flamboyant kind of outfits and his ridiculous hats and all that sort of stuff. So I kind of had a vibe, you know, maybe a Martin Short kind of performance was what I was thinking for him. But yeah, I know what you mean. Some characters you read and they are just they just exist.
Yeah, I'm sure he was described. I'm sure he was described, and for some reason that hasn't resonated, and I'm not sure why that is. Probably me, but I definitely didn't picture him as
Connery. Yeah,
Connery, no.
But does this leave you excited for the next book in this series, for the Inquisition War Part 2?
Really interested to know where it goes. Yeah, so I don't know if excited is the right word. I think. Because there's enough trepidation there about this next story. We could have really awesome bits, but I also feel that it's going to have areas that are going to go off on strange tangents, and I think it's almost. I'll be surprised if it doesn't.
Yeah.
And even the short stories, as much as I like them, there were elements in both of those short stories that you could feel that this is something that will be continually tapped into again, and that we already know that there's stuff in Space Marine. So we know that this is a theme of his writing. And I hope that then to a point where it adds to the story, because I've got no problem being there if it adds, but it's not so sort of out of the story that it brings you out of the story, and I'm thinking about it rather than thinking about the story, which is what happened every time. Like those initial scenes, and we've touched on this obviously, about all three of the male finding her attractive, but it's so strongly evident that it's almost kind of eye-rollingly so. Oh,
I mean, there's like a competition to help her get changed and stuff like that at one point.
Yeah, it's really bad. It's almost, it's like Benny Hill's going to come in a minute. It's elements where you think this is
It does go too far.
Really?
It does.
Yeah, it's almost embarrassing. So, and I hope that they're not. I'm expecting them, but I hope they don't feel like they've been put in there for the reader's titillation or the writer's enjoyment. I hope that they're in there to enhance the story, because if they are, then they have their place for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the next part is Harlequin. So, whether that's the Harlequin man or whether that's a bit of an introduction of some
That would be
Eldar.
my assumption now.
Yeah.
Before reading this, I would have thought maybe Eldar.
Yeah.
So who knows?
That's
My assumption will
intriguing
be
to me.
Harlequin
Yeah.
or
I
whether
think
there's a connection, because there maybe is a connection.
there could be a connection for sure. Yeah.
Eldar was mentioned. I'm trying to remember the reference now.
Yeah, they were mentioned. I think that intrigues me. I would be really interested to see how Watson handles Eldar and Harlequins. I think that potentially he could do some really interesting stuff with those kind of worlds and factions and characters. So yeah, I do look forward to more Watsonian adventures in 40k. I think despite those excesses and the sort of, overly lurid kind of elements, there's also enough great stuff here that I did really enjoy. Sort of, you're panning for gold, and there are some real nuggets of gold.
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
So I look forward to it. But yes, though they're actually technically not GW books now. So the official GW books run of 40k has ended with Inquisitor. But as we know, more books were written during this period. They just never got to be published by GW Books. They were published by Boxtree, the new license holders. So although technically we started this project intending to just do the 17 GW books, there's a good chance, I think, that we'll continue and get into some of those Boxtree titles and get ourselves into Harlequin.
Finish off the trilogies for sure. It feels like
I think so, right?
Feels like it's needed.
But we've got a couple more exciting things coming up. So we're doing a bonus book club that we're going to be reading a Warhammer novel from the Black Library that is Dan Abnett. So this is the Riders and the Dead, which was the sort of prelude to the Storm of Chaos. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that book. I think, an exciting one. I'm going to be doing a load of Storm of Chaos content soon on the channel. So this kind of felt like a good lead in, and just picking up it was recently republished. So it seems like a good title for us to jump into and sort of have a bit of an exploration on.
Looking forward to it. It's all queued up on my Kindle on the way next week. So that will be my evening entertainment. So looking forward to it.
Fantastic. And then we'll be getting back into the GW books for our next month's book, which is Shadowbreed by David Ferring. So this is the continuation of the Conrad trilogy.
Yeah.
Are you looking forward to revisiting?
Conrad? It feels like it's been a little while now with us dipping into Dark Future now 40k. So yeah, I am looking forward to getting back to some early Warhammer fantasy with all the interestingness that entails. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back to Conrad, and I'll be spending some time going back through my notes for that and just sort of refreshing myself. I won't be reading it again, but I'm refreshing my memory. And so I've I think it's just about there, but yeah, so I can hit the ground running, so to speak. But it's going to be good. It's going to be good returning and seeing how we move on from there.
Yeah, I think it will be fun because Conrad, similar in a way to Inquisitor, had some really fun, I thought, some really fun character stuff, some really fun ideas, some great moments, very Warhammer sort of moments in there, and some cool world building. But then it also had some odd structural stuff and some weird choices and a quite sudden ending because it was a
definitely
trilogy.
Not as good an ending as we've just had in the epilogue.
No, it didn't have a solid ending, but it raised enough questions to be an interesting, where's this going to go next? How is this going to play out? So I'm very much looking forward to Shadowbreed. I think it could be fun.
Yeah, I am with all of these because you really don't know what's going to happen.
But yes, that's next time. Until then, where can people find you online, Stu?
At Miniature Realms, Miniature Realms everywhere. Definitely on YouTube, and you can find me on Instagram and X and everything.
Yep. Good stuff. I'll put links to all of those down below and to your Patreon as well. So that's at Miniature Realms. And then, yes, there's going to be links to at Jordan Sorcery on all the platforms as well. Twitter and X and Instagram and Patreon as well for me, if people would like to follow me. But until next time, I think that was another great read, another good conversation. So thank you very much, Stu. And thank you all for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.